The sound of a woman's voice drifting through his garden at twilight made Morgan Hartwell freeze mid-step, the water bucket swinging from his calloused hand as he stood on the porch of his ranch house in the Dakota Territory, just 3 miles outside of Bismarck, where the September wind of 1882 carried the scent of prairie grass and the last blooms of summer. Morgan set the bucket down slowly, his heart hammering in his chest with a mixture of confusion and something he could not quite name. In the 5 years since he had built this ranch with his own 2 hands, he had grown accustomed to silence. The only sounds were the lowing of cattle, the occasional howl of coyotes in the distance, and the whisper of wind through the cottonwood trees he had planted near the house. But this was different. A woman's voice, soft and pure, singing a melody that seemed to wrap around his lonely heart and squeeze. He moved quietly around the side of the house, following the sound to the small vegetable garden he had put in behind the barn. The garden had been his mother's idea before she passed 2 winters ago, her last gift to him before the fever took her. He still tended it carefully, growing tomatoes and beans and squash, though he often wondered why he bothered when there was no one to share the harvest with. There, kneeling among the rows of vegetables, was a young woman in a faded calico dress, her dark hair falling loose around her shoulders as she picked the ripe tomatoes and placed them gently in a cloth sack beside her. She sang as she worked, her voice rising and falling with a melody that Morgan had never heard before, something that sounded like a lullaby mixed with a hymn, words in a language he did not recognize. Morgan cleared his throat, and the singing stopped abruptly. The woman spun around, her eyes wide with fear, clutching a tomato to her chest. She was younger than he had expected, perhaps 22 or 23, with olive skin and dark eyes that reminded him of the Spanish traders who sometimes passed through Bismarck. Her face was smudged with dirt, and there were dark circles under her eyes that spoke of exhaustion and hunger. "I am sorry," she said quickly, her English heavily accented. "I was so hungry. I did not think anyone was here." Morgan raised his hand slowly, trying to show he meant no harm. At 29, he had learned that quick movements could startle people, especially those who looked as frightened as this young woman did. "It is all right," he said quietly. "You can have the tomatoes. Take as many as you need." She looked at him warily, as if trying to determine whether he was telling the truth. "You are not angry." "No, madam, but I am curious how you ended up in my garden." The woman's shoulders sagged slightly, and she set the tomato back down in the sack. "I have been walking for many days. I saw your house and thought perhaps you might have food I could take. I did not mean to steal, but I have not eaten in 2 days." Morgan felt something twist in his chest. He had been hungry before, in those early years after his father died when he and his mother had struggled to keep the ranch going. He remembered the gnawing ache in his belly, the weakness in his limbs. "Come inside," he said. "I will make you something to eat." The woman hesitated, her eyes darting toward the darkening horizon. "I do not want to impose. It is no imposition. Besides, you will not make it far in the dark, and there are wolves out here." That seemed to decide her. She picked up her cloth sack and followed him toward the house, her steps slow and careful as if she expected him to change his mind at any moment. Morgan led her through the back door into the kitchen, a simple room with a wood-burning stove, a table he had built himself, and shelves lined with jars of preserved food. "Sit," he said, gesturing to one of the chairs. "I will heat up some stew." The woman sat gingerly, her hands folded in her lap as she watched him move around the kitchen. Morgan could feel her eyes on him as he stoked the fire in the stove and poured leftover beef stew into a pot. He cut thick slices of bread and set them on a plate, then poured her a glass of water from the pitcher on the counter. "What is your name?" he asked as he worked. Marisol, she said softly. Marisol Navarro. I am Morgan Hartwell. This is my ranch. You live here alone. I do now. My mother passed 2 years ago. I am sorry, Marisol said, and there was genuine sympathy in her voice. Morgan stirred the stew, watching the steam rise from the pot. Where are you from, Miss Navarro? She was quiet for a long moment, and when he glanced back at her, he saw that her eyes had filled with tears. I came from Santa Fe, she said finally. My family, they had a small ranch there, but my father, he made some bad business deals and we lost everything. He arranged for me to marry a man in Bismarck, a merchant who needed a wife. But when I arrived, I discovered that this man, he was not what my father believed. He was cruel and he drank too much. I ran away 3 days ago. Morgan ladled the stew into a bowl and set it in front of her along with the bread. Did he hurt you? Marisol looked down at the food, her hands trembling slightly as she picked up the spoon. He tried, but I left before he could do much damage. I have been hiding in barns and walking at night, trying to figure out what to do. I cannot go back to Santa Fe. My family has nothing and they need the money this man promised my father, but I cannot marry him either. Morgan sat down across from her, watching as she ate. She tried to go slowly at first, but hunger won out and soon she was eating quickly, barely pausing to breathe. He waited until she had finished the entire bowl before speaking again. You can stay here tonight, he said. I have a spare room. It was my mother's. In the morning, we can figure out what to do. Marisol looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. Why would you help me? You do not know me. Morgan thought about that question, trying to find the right words. The truth was, he did not know why he was helping her beyond the simple fact that it felt like the right thing to do. But there was something else too, something he could not quite articulate. When he had heard her singing in his garden, it had been like a light in the darkness, a reminder that there was beauty in the world beyond the endless cycle of work and loneliness that had defined his life for so long. Because you need help, he said finally. And because I have the means to provide it. Marisol nodded slowly, and for the first time since he had found her, a small smile crossed her face. Thank you, Mr. Hartwell. Call me Morgan. He showed her to his mother's room, a small space with a narrow bed covered in a quilt his mother had sewn, a dresser with a cracked mirror, and a window that looked out over the prairie. Marisol stood in the doorway, taking it all in with wide eyes. It is perfect, she whispered. Thank you. Morgan left her there and returned to the kitchen, where he washed the dishes and banked the fire in the stove. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He had not spoken to a woman other than the shopkeeper's wife in town for months, and now there was one sleeping in his mother's room. It felt strange and unsettling, but also strangely right. That night, as he lay in his own bed, Morgan could hear Marisol moving around in the next room, the soft creak of the floorboards, the rustle of fabric as she settled into the bed. He wondered what she was thinking, whether she was afraid, whether she regretted coming here. But mostly, he thought about her voice, that beautiful, haunting melody that had drawn him to the garden like a moth to flame. When Morgan woke the next morning, the sun was already well above the horizon, and he could smell coffee brewing. He dressed quickly and made his way to the kitchen, where he found Marisol standing by the stove, her hair tied back in a braid, stirring something in a pan. Good morning, she said, glancing over her shoulder at him. I hope you do not mind. I found eggs and made breakfast. Morgan sat down at the table, still trying to shake off the grogginess of sleep. I do not mind at all. She set a plate in front of him, scrambled eggs with bits of wild onion mixed in, along with more of the bread from the night before, toasted over the stove. It was simple food, but it tasted better than anything he had made for himself in months. "This is good," he said. Marisol smiled and sat down across from him with her own plate. "My mother taught me to cook. She said a woman should always know how to feed her family." They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes before Morgan spoke again. "I have been thinking about your situation. If you do not want to marry that man in Bismarck, you will need to find another way to support yourself. There are not many options for women out here, but I might have an idea." Marisol looked up at him, her dark eyes curious. "What kind of idea?" "I need help around the ranch," Morgan said slowly, working through the plan as he spoke. "I have been managing on my own, but it is too much work for one person, especially during harvest season. If you are willing to work, I can pay you a fair wage. It is not much, but it would give you time to figure out what you want to do next." Marisol set down her fork, her expression thoughtful. "You would hire me, even though I am a woman? I do not see why that should matter. You can cook, and I am sure there are other things you can do around here. Besides, I could use the company." She was quiet for a long moment, and Morgan began to worry that he had overstepped, that she would think he had ulterior motives. But then she nodded, her smile returning. "I would like that very much. Thank you, Morgan." Over the following days, Marisol settled into life on the ranch with surprising ease. She took over the cooking and the care of the vegetable garden, and she proved to be a quick learner when it came to other tasks. Morgan taught her how to milk the cow, how to collect eggs from the chickens, and how to mend fences. In return, she brought a warmth to the ranch that he had not realized was missing. But it was her singing that truly transformed his days. She sang while she worked, her voice carrying across the yard as she hung laundry or tended the garden. She sang old Spanish songs that her mother had taught her, ballads about love and loss and longing. Sometimes in the evenings, she would sit on the porch with a cup of tea and sing while Morgan worked on repairing tack or sharpening tools, and he would find himself pausing to listen, captivated by the beauty of her voice. One evening, about a week after Marisol had arrived, Morgan was sitting on the porch steps, working on fixing a bridle when she came out and sat down beside him. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, and the air had that crisp quality that spoke of autumn's approach. "This place is beautiful," Marisol said, looking out over the prairie. "So open and free. In Santa Fe we were surrounded by mountains. I could never see the horizon like this." Morgan glanced at her, noting the way the fading light caught in her hair, turning it almost bronze. "I have always loved it here. My father came to Dakota Territory when I was just a boy, right after the war. He said he wanted a fresh start, somewhere he could build something that was truly his." "He would be proud of what you have done," Marisol said softly. "I hope so." "He died before he could see much of it. Heart gave out when I was 16. After that, it was just me and my mother trying to keep everything going." Marisol reached out and placed her hand over his, a simple gesture that sent a jolt through Morgan's entire body. "You are a good man, Morgan Hartwell. Not many men would have helped a stranger the way you helped me." Morgan turned his hand over, lacing his fingers through hers. It was the first time he had held a woman's hand in years, and it felt both terrifying and wonderful. "You are not a stranger anymore," he said quietly. She smiled at that, and they sat together in comfortable silence, watching as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. As the days turned into weeks, Morgan found himself falling into a new routine, one that revolved around Marisol's presence. He would wake early and do the morning chores, then come in for the breakfast she had prepared. They would work together during the day, side by side in the fields or tending to the animals. In the evenings, they would share dinner and then sit on the porch, talking about their lives, their dreams, their fears. Morgan learned that Marisol had once dreamed of becoming a teacher, but her family's financial troubles had put an end to that. She learned that Morgan had always wanted to see the ocean, but he had never been more than 100 miles from Bismarck. They discovered that they both loved thunderstorms, the way the rain washed everything clean, and that they both had a weakness for apple pie. But more than anything, Morgan found himself falling in love with her voice. It became the soundtrack of his days, a constant presence that filled the empty spaces in his life. When she sang, he felt less alone, less adrift. Her voice was a bridge between his past and his future, a reminder that life could be more than just work and survival. One afternoon in early October, Morgan was in the barn repairing a broken wagon wheel when he heard Marisol scream. He dropped his tools and ran toward the house, his heart pounding with fear. He found her in the yard, backing away from a rattlesnake that had coiled near the chicken coop, its tail buzzing a warning. Morgan grabbed a hoe that was leaning against the side of the house and carefully approached the snake. It struck at him once, but he was ready, bringing the hoe down hard and severing its head from its body. Marisol let out a shaky breath, her hand pressed to her chest. "Are you all right?" Morgan asked, dropping the hoe and moving to her side. She nodded, but he could see that she was trembling. "I nearly stepped on it. I did not see it until it was too late." Morgan wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. She leaned into him, her face pressed against his chest, and he could feel her heart racing. "You are safe now," he murmured into her hair. "I have you." They stood like that for a long moment, holding each other in the afternoon sun, and Morgan realized that something had shifted between them. What had started as an act of kindness had grown into something deeper, something that made his heart ache with longing. That evening, after they had finished dinner, Marisol asked Morgan to sit with her on the porch. She had a serious expression on her face, and he felt a flutter of anxiety in his stomach. "I need to tell you something," she said, her hands folded in her lap. "I have been here for almost a month now, and I have been thinking about my future, about what I want." Morgan felt his chest tighten. He had been dreading this conversation, knowing that eventually Marisol would decide to move on to find her own place in the world. "What is it?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. She turned to face him, her dark eyes searching his. "I do not want to leave here, Morgan. I know I came here by accident, and I know you took me in out of kindness. But this place, it feels like home. You feel like home." Morgan's breath caught in his throat. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that I have feelings for you," Marisol said, her voice trembling slightly. "I think I have had them for weeks now, but I was afraid to say anything. I did not want to make you uncomfortable or make you think that I was trying to take advantage of your kindness." Morgan reached out and took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "You are not taking advantage of anything. I have feelings for you too, Marisol. I think I have since the first night I heard you singing in my garden." She let out a soft laugh, her eyes shining with tears. "Really? Really?" he said, and then he leaned in and kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, tentative and sweet, but it sent a warmth through Morgan's entire body. When they pulled apart, Marisol was smiling, and he could see the happiness radiating from her face. "I do not know what the future holds," Morgan said, still holding her hand. "But I do know that I want you to be a part of it, if you will have me." "I will," Marisol said. "I will have you, Morgan Hartwell." They spent the rest of the evening on the porch, talking about their plans, about what their life together might look like. Morgan told her about his dreams of expanding the ranch, of building a bigger house, of starting a family. Marisol told him about wanting to plant a proper flower garden, about teaching the children in Bismarck to read, about growing old together on this land. As the weeks passed, their relationship deepened. Morgan and Marisol fell into an easy intimacy, sharing not just their days but their hopes and fears, their laughter and their sorrows. Morgan found himself looking forward to every moment with her, from the simple act of sharing breakfast to the quiet evenings when she would sing to him as they sat by the fire. In November, Morgan traveled into Bismarck to buy supplies for the coming winter. He also made a stop at the jeweler's shop, where he purchased a simple gold ring with a small garnet stone. The jeweler, an elderly German man named Mr. Schmidt, raised an eyebrow when Morgan made his selection. "Getting married, Mr. Hartwell?" he asked. "I am planning to propose," Morgan said, feeling a flush creep up his neck. Mr. Schmidt smiled. "It is about time. A man should not live alone out there on that ranch. You need someone to keep you company." Morgan left the shop with the ring carefully wrapped and tucked into his coat pocket. On the ride back to the ranch, he practiced what he would say, running through different versions of his proposal in his mind. He wanted it to be perfect, wanted Marisol to know just how much she meant to him. When he arrived home, Marisol was in the kitchen preparing dinner. The smell of roasting chicken filled the house, and Morgan felt a surge of contentment. This was what home was supposed to feel like, he realized. Not just a place to sleep and eat, but a place filled with warmth and love and the presence of someone who made every day brighter. "How was town?" Marisol asked, looking up from the pot she was stirring. "Good," Morgan said, hanging up his coat. "I got everything we need for winter, and I got something else too." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small wrapped package, holding it out to her. Marisol wiped her hands on her apron and took the package, her expression curious. "What is this?" she asked. "Open it and see." She carefully unwrapped the paper, and when she saw the ring box inside, her eyes widened. She looked up at Morgan, her hand trembling slightly as she opened the box to reveal the ring. "Marisol Navarro," Morgan said, moving to stand in front of her. He took the box from her hands and pulled out the ring. "From the moment I heard you singing in my garden, my life has been different. You brought light and music and joy to a place that had been dark and silent for too long. I love you, and I cannot imagine spending another day without you by my side. Will you marry me?" Tears were streaming down Marisol's face as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Morgan, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and then he pulled her into his arms, kissing her deeply. When they finally pulled apart, Marisol was laughing and crying at the same time, her hands cupping his face. "I love you," she said. "I love you so much." They were married 3 weeks later in the small church in Bismarck, with the minister and his wife as witnesses. Marisol wore a simple dress of blue calico that Morgan had bought for her in town, and Morgan wore his best suit, the one he had not worn since his mother's funeral. It was a quiet ceremony, but it was perfect, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Morgan felt a happiness so profound it almost brought him to his knees. They spent their wedding night in the ranch house, in Morgan's bed, which was now their bed. Morgan was gentle with Marisol, mindful of her innocence, and she responded to him with a passion that surprised and delighted them both. Afterwards, as they lay tangled together in the darkness, Marisol sang softly, a lullaby her mother used to sing to her, and Morgan felt a peace settle over him that he had never known before. Winter came to the Dakota Territory with a vengeance that year, bringing blizzards that buried the ranch under feet of snow and temperatures so cold that the water in the trough froze solid overnight. But inside the house, Morgan and Marisol were warm and content. They spent their days tending to the animals, keeping the fires burning and working on projects to pass the time. Marisol sewed quilts and curtains, while Morgan carved wooden toys for the children they hoped to have someday. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, and Marisol would sing. Sometimes she sang the old Spanish songs from her childhood, and sometimes she sang hymns or ballads she had learned from Morgan's mother's old songbook. Her voice filled the house, a constant reminder of the love that bound them together. One particularly cold night in January, as they sat together on the sofa, Marisol placed Morgan's hand on her stomach and smiled. "I think I am with child," she said softly. Morgan felt his heart skip a beat. "Are you sure?" "I have missed my monthly courses twice now, and I have been feeling sick in the mornings. I am fairly certain." Morgan pulled her into his arms, holding her close as joy flooded through him. "We are going to have a baby," he whispered, hardly able to believe it. Marisol nodded against his chest. "We are going to be a family." The months that followed were both exciting and terrifying. Morgan read every book he could find on childbirth and the care of infants, determined to be prepared. He made improvements to the house, adding shelves for baby things and reinforcing the walls to keep out drafts. Marisol continued to work as much as she could, though Morgan insisted she take it easy as her belly grew larger. In late August of 1883, on a hot afternoon when the cicadas sang in the trees, Marisol went into labor. Morgan rode to Bismarck to fetch the midwife, a stern but capable woman named Mrs. Patterson, who had delivered half the babies in the territory. The labor was long and difficult, and Morgan spent most of it pacing the kitchen, listening to Marisol's cries and feeling utterly helpless. Finally, just as the sun was beginning to set, he heard a new sound, the thin, wailing cry of a newborn baby. Mrs. Patterson emerged from the bedroom, wiping her hands on a towel. "You have a son, Mr. Hartwell," she said with a tired smile. Morgan rushed past her into the bedroom, where Marisol lay exhausted in the bed, her hair plastered to her forehead with sweat. In her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in a blanket, and when Morgan approached, she pulled back the fabric to reveal the most beautiful sight he had ever seen: his son. A perfect little boy with a shock of dark hair and tiny fists that waved in the air. Morgan reached out and gently touched one of those fists, marveling at how small and delicate it was. The baby's fingers wrapped around his thumb, and Morgan felt his eyes fill with tears. "He is perfect," Morgan whispered. "You did so well, my love." Marisol smiled up at him, her eyes shining with exhaustion and joy. What should we name him? They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy, going back and forth between family names and names they simply liked. In the end, they decided on Matthew after Morgan's father, Matthew John Hartwell. The first few months with Matthew were both wonderful and exhausting. The baby had healthy lungs and used them frequently, especially at night. Morgan and Marisol took turns walking him around the house, singing to him, rocking him until he finally fell asleep. Marisol's voice, which had once filled the house all day long, was now often quieter, reserved for lullabies in the middle of the night. But Morgan did not mind. He loved being a father, loved watching his son grow and change every day. Matthew had Marisol's dark eyes and Morgan's stubborn chin, and he was curious about everything, always reaching for things, always trying to see what was happening around him. As Matthew grew, so did the ranch. Morgan hired a young man named Peter Donnelly to help with the heavier work, which gave him more time to spend with his family. Peter was 18, fresh from Ireland, and eager to learn about ranching. He proved to be a hard worker and a quick learner, and Morgan was grateful for his help. Marisol gradually returned to her routines, though now they included caring for Matthew. She would strap him to her back in a cloth carrier while she worked in the garden, singing to him as she tended the vegetables. Matthew seemed to love the sound of her voice, often falling asleep to the rhythm of her songs. One day, when Matthew was about 6 months old, a visitor arrived at the ranch. Morgan was in the corral, working with a young horse, when he saw a wagon approaching on the road. He handed the lead rope to Peter and walked toward the house, shading his eyes against the sun to get a better look at the newcomer. The wagon pulled to a stop in front of the house, and a man climbed down, tall and broad-shouldered, with graying hair and a weathered face. He looked familiar, and it took Morgan a moment to place him. It was Reverend Thompson, the minister who had married him and Marisol. "Reverend," Morgan said, extending his hand, "this is a surprise. What brings you out this way?" Reverend Thompson shook his hand, but his expression was serious. "I am afraid I have some difficult news, Morgan. There is a man in Bismarck looking for your wife. He claims she was promised to him in marriage and that she ran away before fulfilling her obligation. He is threatening to make trouble." Morgan felt his blood run cold. "Daniel Whitmore." "Yes, that is his name. He came to me asking if I knew anything about Marisol's whereabouts. I did not tell him anything, of course, but he is determined. He has hired a lawyer and is claiming that he is owed compensation for breach of contract." Morgan's jaw tightened. He had known this might happen someday, but he had hoped that Whitmore would simply forget about Marisol and move on. Clearly, that had been foolish thinking. "Thank you for warning me, Reverend," Morgan said. "I will handle this." "Be careful, Morgan. Whitmore is not a good man, and he has some influence in town. He owns the dry goods store and is friendly with the sheriff." After the Reverend left, Morgan went inside to tell Marisol what had happened. She was in the sitting room nursing Matthew, and when she saw his face, her expression grew worried. "What is wrong?" she asked. Morgan sat down beside her and took her free hand. "Daniel Whitmore is in Bismarck. He is looking for you, claiming you owe him a marriage." Marisol's face went pale. "What are we going to do?" "I am going to go into town and talk to him," Morgan said firmly. "I will make it clear that you are my wife now and that he has no claim on you. Morgan, he is dangerous. You do not know what he is capable of. I do not care. You are my wife, and no one is going to take you away from me." The next morning, Morgan rode into Bismarck, his heart heavy with worry but his resolve firm. He found Daniel Whitmore at his dry goods store, a man in his late 40s with thinning hair and a cruel set to his mouth. When Morgan walked in, Whitmore looked up from the ledger he was writing in and sneered. "Can I help you?" Whitmore asked. "I am Morgan Hartwell," Morgan said, keeping his voice steady. "I understand you have been asking about Marisol Navarro." Whitmore's expression hardened. "So you are the one who stole my bride. I should have known. Some cowboy thinking he can just take what does not belong to him." "Marisol is not property," Morgan said, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "She is a human being and she chose to marry me. Whatever agreement you had with her father is void." "That is not how the law sees it," Whitmore said, setting down his pen. "Her father took my money and I am entitled to what I paid for. Either she comes back to me or you pay me what I am owed, $500. Morgan felt a surge of anger. $500 was more than he could afford, especially after the expenses of building the ranch and starting a family. But he was not about to let this man intimidate him. "Marisol is not coming back to you," Morgan said firmly, "and I am not paying you a cent. If you want to take this to court, go ahead. But I promise you, no judge is going to side with a man who treats women like livestock." Whitmore's face turned red with anger. "Get out of my store," he snarled. "This is not over, Hartwell, not by a long shot." Morgan left the store, his heart pounding. He knew he had made an enemy, but he did not regret standing up to Whitmore. As he rode back to the ranch, he tried to think of a way to resolve the situation without putting Marisol at risk. Over the next few weeks, the tension hung over the ranch like a storm cloud. Morgan hired a lawyer in Bismarck, a young man named Samuel Brooks, who assured him that Whitmore's claim was baseless. But legal battles took time and money, and Morgan worried about what might happen in the meantime. One evening, as Morgan was tending to the horses in the barn, Peter came running in, his face flushed with alarm. "Mr. Hartwell, there are men coming up the road, 3 of them, and they do not look friendly." Morgan grabbed his rifle from where it hung on the wall and hurried outside. Sure enough, 3 men on horseback were approaching the house. One of them was Daniel Whitmore. The other 2 looked like hired guns, rough men with hard eyes and holstered pistols. Marisol appeared in the doorway of the house, Matthew in her arms, her face pale with fear. Morgan motioned for her to go back inside, and she retreated, though he could see her watching through the window. The 3 men stopped their horses in front of the house, and Whitmore dismounted, his expression smug. "Hartwell," he said, "I have come to collect what is mine." "You have no right to be here," Morgan said, keeping his rifle at his side but ready to raise it if needed. "Leave now, or I will have the sheriff out here." Whitmore laughed. "The sheriff is a friend of mine, Hartwell. He is not going to help you. Now I am going to make this simple. Hand over Marisol, or we will take her by force." Morgan raised the rifle, pointing it directly at Whitmore. "You are not taking anyone. This is my land and you are trespassing. Leave now, or I will defend my property." One of the hired guns reached for his pistol, but before he could draw it, a shot rang out from the direction of the barn. The man cried out and grabbed his arm, blood seeping between his fingers. Everyone turned to see Peter standing there, his own rifle raised. "The next one goes in your chest," Peter called out, his voice steady despite his youth. Whitmore's face turned purple with rage, but he seemed to realize that he was outmatched. "This is not over, Hartwell," he spat. "You will regret this." He and his men rode off, leaving Morgan and Peter standing in the yard, their rifles still raised. Morgan lowered his weapon slowly, his hands trembling with adrenaline. "Thank you, Peter," he said. "You might have just saved our lives." Peter nodded, his face pale. "I could not just stand by and let them hurt you and Mrs. Hartwell." Morgan went inside to comfort Marisol, who was shaking with fear, tears streaming down her face as she held Matthew close. "It is all right," Morgan murmured, wrapping his arms around both of them. "He is gone. We are safe." But Morgan knew that the danger had not passed. Whitmore would be back, and next time he might bring more men. Morgan needed to find a way to end this once and for all. The next day, Morgan rode into Bismarck and went straight to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Clausen was a gruff man in his 50s with a reputation for being fair but firm. He listened as Morgan explained the situation, his expression growing darker as the story unfolded. "Whitmore sent armed men to your ranch?" the sheriff asked, his tone incredulous. "He did." "One of them reached for his gun, and my hired hand shot him in the arm to stop him." The sheriff leaned back in his chair, stroking his beard thoughtfully. "I have known Daniel Whitmore for years. He is a hard man, but I did not think he would go this far. This is serious business, Hartwell. Threatening a man's family is a crime." "Will you do something about it?" Morgan asked. "I will have a talk with Whitmore, but you need to understand if this goes to court, it is going to be your word against his. You need proof." Morgan left the sheriff's office feeling frustrated but not defeated. He knew he needed to be smart about this, to find a way to expose Whitmore for what he truly was. The opportunity came a few days later when Morgan was in town buying supplies. He overheard a conversation between 2 women outside the general store, talking in hushed tones about a young woman who had worked as a maid in Whitmore's house. "She left town in a hurry," one of the women was saying. "Said she could not work there anymore, that Mr. Whitmore made her uncomfortable." Morgan approached the women carefully, tipping his hat. "Pardon me, ladies, but I could not help but overhear. Do you know where this young woman went?" The older of the 2 women, a plump woman with graying hair, looked at him suspiciously. "Why do you want to know?" "Because I think she might have information that could help me in a legal matter involving Mr. Whitmore." The woman studied him for a moment, then seemed to make a decision. "Her name is Clara Jensen. She went to stay with her sister in Mandan. But be careful, young man. Whitmore is not someone you want to cross." Morgan thanked the women and immediately set out for Mandan, a town about 30 miles south of Bismarck. He found Clara Jensen working at a boarding house, a shy young woman of about 20 with haunted eyes. At first, she was reluctant to talk to him, but when Morgan explained his situation and assured her that he only wanted to protect his wife, she finally opened up. "Mr. Whitmore is a cruel man," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He would drink and then become violent. He hit me several times when I did not work fast enough or when his dinner was not to his liking. And he tried to force himself on me one night. I managed to get away and left the next morning. I was too afraid to tell anyone because he has so many friends in town." "Would you be willing to testify to that in court?" Morgan asked gently. Clara looked terrified at the thought, but after a long moment she nodded. "If it will help keep another woman safe from him, then yes, I will testify." Morgan thanked her and promised to have his lawyer contact her. On the ride back to the ranch, he felt a sense of hope for the first time in weeks. With Clara's testimony, they might finally be able to put an end to Whitmore's threats. The court hearing took place in early October. The courtroom was packed with people from Bismarck, curious about the case that had been the talk of the town for weeks. Morgan sat at the plaintiff's table with his lawyer, Samuel Brooks, while Whitmore sat across the aisle with his own lawyer, a slick-looking man from Fargo. Marisol was called to testify first. She walked to the stand with her head held high, though Morgan could see the fear in her eyes. She told the judge about her family's situation in Santa Fe, about the arrangement her father had made with Whitmore, and about the frightening encounter she had had with him when she arrived in Bismarck. "He was drunk when I arrived," Marisol said, her voice steady despite her nerves. "He grabbed me and said that I belonged to him now, that I would do whatever he told me to do. He tried to kiss me, and when I pushed him away, he hit me. That is when I ran." Whitmore's lawyer tried to discredit her, suggesting that she was making up the story to avoid her obligations, but Marisol did not waver. When Clara Jensen took the stand and told her own story of abuse at Whitmore's hands, the mood in the courtroom shifted dramatically. The judge, a stern man named Judge Harrington, listened to all the testimony with a grave expression. When both sides had presented their cases, he called for a brief recess to consider his decision. Morgan sat with Marisol in the hallway outside the courtroom, holding her hand tightly. "Whatever happens, we will face it together," he said. When they were called back into the courtroom, Judge Harrington looked directly at Whitmore as he delivered his verdict. "Mr. Whitmore, based on the testimony I have heard today, it is clear that you are not a man who deserves to have any claim on Miss Navarro, now Mrs. Hartwell. The marriage arrangement made by her father is hereby deemed void due to your abusive behavior and threats. Furthermore, I am ordering you to pay restitution to Mrs. Hartwell for the distress you have caused her, and you are to have no further contact with the Hartwell family. If you violate this order, you will face criminal charges. Case dismissed." The courtroom erupted in murmurs, and Morgan felt a wave of relief wash over him. It was over. They were truly free. Outside the courthouse, Morgan and Marisol stood in the autumn sunlight, holding each other tightly. Matthew, who had been watched by Mrs. Patterson during the hearing, was brought to them, and Morgan lifted his son into his arms, feeling a completeness that he had never experienced before. "We can finally move forward," Marisol said, her eyes shining with tears of relief. "We can build our life without fear." Morgan kissed her forehead. "Yes, we can." They returned to the ranch and threw themselves into their life with renewed energy. The years that followed were good ones, filled with hard work and simple joys. The ranch prospered, and Morgan was able to expand his herd and purchase more land. Peter Donnelly proved to be an invaluable partner, eventually becoming Morgan's foreman. Marisol gave birth to a daughter 2 years after Matthew was born. They named her Sarah, after Morgan's mother. Sarah had her father's light hair and her mother's musical voice, and from the time she could talk, she was singing. Marisol taught both children the songs she had learned from her own mother, and the house was always filled with music. When Matthew was 5 and Sarah was 3, Marisol became pregnant again. This time, she gave birth to twin boys, whom they named Thomas and Daniel, though they called him Danny to distinguish him from the man who had once threatened their happiness. The twins were a handful, constantly getting into mischief, but they brought even more laughter and chaos to the Hartwell household. As the children grew, Morgan and Marisol worked to instill in them the values that had guided their own lives: hard work, kindness, and the importance of family. Matthew showed an early aptitude for ranching and spent every spare moment with his father, learning how to care for the cattle and manage the land. Sarah had her mother's gentle spirit and spent hours in the garden, coaxing flowers and vegetables to grow. The twins were still young enough that their interests changed by the day, but they adored their older siblings and followed them everywhere. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Morgan took Marisol into Bismarck for a rare night away from the ranch. They left the children in Peter's capable care and stayed at the hotel in town, dining at the restaurant and dancing to the music of a traveling band that had come through. As they danced, Morgan looked down at his wife, marveling at how beautiful she still was, how much he loved her. Her hair had a few strands of silver now, and there were lines around her eyes from years of laughter and hard work, but to him, she was as radiant as the day he had found her singing in his garden. "What are you thinking about?" Marisol asked, her hand resting on his shoulder as they swayed to the music. "I am thinking about how lucky I am," Morgan said. "How lucky I am to have found you, to have built this life with you. Sometimes I still cannot believe it is real." Marisol smiled up at him, her dark eyes warm with love. "It is real, my love, and it is only going to get better." She was right. The years continued to be kind to them. The ranch grew into one of the most successful in the territory, and the Hartwell name became synonymous with honesty and quality. Morgan took great pride in his work, but he never forgot that the real treasure in his life was his family. As the children grew older, they each found their own paths. Matthew, at 18, took over more responsibilities on the ranch, working alongside his father with a maturity beyond his years. He had inherited Morgan's steady temperament and his mother's compassion, and Morgan knew that one day, the ranch would be in good hands. Sarah, at 16, had become a gifted singer like her mother. She performed at church functions and social gatherings, and people would travel from miles around to hear her voice. She had also developed an interest in teaching and spent her free time tutoring younger children in Bismarck. The twins, now 13, were still wild and energetic, but they were good boys with kind hearts. They loved working with the horses and had a natural talent for it, breaking and training them with patience and skill. One evening, as Morgan and Marisol sat on the porch watching the sunset, their grandchildren playing in the yard, Matthew's 2 children from his recent marriage to a sweet girl named Emily from town, Marisol rested her head on Morgan's shoulder. "Do you remember the night you found me in your garden?" she asked softly. "How could I forget?" Morgan replied, wrapping his arm around her. It was the night my life changed forever. I was so scared that night, Marisol said. I had no idea what was going to happen to me. But then I heard myself singing and it calmed me. And then you appeared and you were so kind. You did not have to help me, but you did. I think fate brought you to me, Morgan said. I was so lonely before you came. I did not even realize how lonely I was until I heard your voice and knew that I never wanted to be without it again. Marisol turned and kissed him, a long, tender kiss that held all the love and gratitude of their years together. When they pulled apart, she was smiling. Your voice became the melody of my days, Morgan said, echoing the thought he had had so many years ago. And it still is, every single day. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching as the sky turned from gold to pink to deep purple. In the distance, they could hear Sarah singing to her niece and nephew, her voice clear and pure, carrying across the prairie like a promise of all the good things that life could hold. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Morgan thought about all the years that had passed since that fateful September evening in 1882. He thought about the struggles they had faced, the fears they had overcome, and the love that had sustained them through it all. Life on the Dakota prairie was not easy. The winters were harsh, the summers were hot, and there was always work to be done. But Morgan would not have traded it for anything. This land, this house, this family, they were everything he had ever wanted and more. As the years continued to pass, Morgan and Marisol grew old together, their love deepening with each passing season. They watched their children marry and start families of their own, filling the ranch with the laughter of grandchildren and eventually great-grandchildren. Matthew took over the ranch when Morgan turned 60, allowing Morgan and Marisol to finally slow down and enjoy their golden years. They spent their days tending to Marisol's flower garden, which had grown into a sprawling oasis of color and beauty, and sitting on the porch, watching the younger generations carry on the legacy they had built. Marisol's voice, though softer now with age, never stopped singing. She sang lullabies to her grandchildren, hymns at church, and the old Spanish songs from her childhood when she and Morgan were alone together. Her voice remained the constant thread that wove through Morgan's life, a reminder of the day she had stumbled into his garden and changed everything. On their 50th wedding anniversary, the entire family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. There were more than 30 people there, children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, all connected by the love that Morgan and Marisol had built. Tables were set up in the yard, laden with food, and there was music and dancing late into the night. As the sun began to set, Sarah stood up and asked for everyone's attention. "I would like to propose a toast," she said, raising her glass. "To my parents, Morgan and Marisol Hartwell, who taught us what true love looks like. You showed us that love is not just a feeling but a choice you make every day, through the hard times and the good times. Thank you for being the foundation of this family. We love you both so much." Everyone raised their glasses and Morgan felt his eyes fill with tears. He looked at Marisol, who was crying too, her hand clasped tightly in his. "We did good," Morgan whispered to her. "We did," Marisol agreed. "We did very good." As the celebration continued around them, Morgan and Marisol slipped away from the crowd and walked hand in hand to the spot where he had first found her all those years ago. The garden had changed over the decades, but it was still there, a testament to the beginning of their story. "Do you remember what you were singing that night?" Morgan asked. Marisol smiled. "I do. It was a song my mother taught me about finding home in unexpected places. I did not realize at the time how prophetic it was. Will you sing it for me now?" Marisol's voice rose in the twilight, the same melody that had captured Morgan's heart 50 years ago. As he listened, Morgan closed his eyes and felt the weight of all the years they had shared, all the love and laughter and tears. It had been a good life, a life beyond anything he could have imagined when he was a lonely rancher working his land in solitude. When the song ended, they stood together in the fading light, holding each other close. Around them, the sounds of their family celebrating drifted on the evening breeze, mingling with the rustle of the prairie grass and the distant call of a meadowlark. "Thank you," Morgan said softly. "For what?" Marisol asked. "For singing in my garden that night, for staying, for loving me, for everything." Marisol reached up and cupped his face in her hands, looking into his eyes with all the love in her heart. "You saved me, Morgan Hartwell. You gave me a home and a family and a life I never dreamed I could have. I should be thanking you." "Then let us call it even," Morgan said with a smile. They walked back to the celebration together, their steps slower now but no less sure. The party continued late into the night, with music and stories and laughter echoing across the ranch. And through it all, Morgan and Marisol sat side by side, surrounded by the family they had created, knowing that they had built something that would last long after they were gone. The years that followed were gentle ones. Morgan's health began to decline when he was in his early 70s, his body finally giving in to the decades of hard work. Marisol cared for him with the same devotion she had shown throughout their marriage, sitting by his side, singing to him when the pain was bad, holding his hand through the long nights. On a warm June morning, with Marisol beside him and the sound of birdsong drifting through the open window, Morgan Hartwell passed peacefully in his sleep. He was 74 years old, and he died knowing that he had been loved and that he had loved in return. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people, a testament to the impact Morgan had had on the community. He was buried on a hill overlooking the ranch, in a spot where he could see the house and the garden and the endless expanse of prairie he had loved so much. Marisol lived for another 5 years after Morgan's death. She spent her days in the garden, tending to the flowers and vegetables, and in the evenings, she would sit on the porch and sing. Her children worried about her being alone, but she assured them that she was fine, that she could still feel Morgan's presence all around her. On a crisp October evening, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, Marisol Hartwell closed her eyes for the last time. She was 78 years old, and her last words were a soft humming of the song she had been singing the night Morgan found her in his garden. She was buried beside Morgan on the hill, and on her gravestone, beneath her name and the dates of her birth and death, were the words. Her voice was the melody of his days. The ranch continued to thrive under Matthew's care, and then his sons and his sons after that. The Hartwell family became one of the founding families of the region, their name carried forward through generations. And though time moved on and the world changed, the story of Morgan and Marisol remained, passed down from parents to children, a reminder that love could be found in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes a single voice singing in a garden could change everything. The garden where it all began was preserved by the family, maintained with care through the decades. Every spring, Marisol's descendants would plant new flowers there, keeping alive the beauty that she had created. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind was just right, people swore they could still hear the faint echo of a woman singing, her voice carrying across the prairie like a promise that love never truly dies. The ranch house still stood, enlarged and modernized over the years, but still recognizable as the home that Morgan had built with his own hands. Inside, in a place of honor, hung a portrait of Morgan and Marisol taken on their 50th anniversary, their faces lined with age but their eyes still bright with love. Beside it was the small cloth sack Marisol had used to gather tomatoes that first night, carefully preserved as a family treasure. The story of how a lonely rancher found a woman singing softly in his garden, and how her voice became the melody of his days, lived on as more than just a story. It became a legacy, a testament to the power of kindness, the strength of love, and the way that two people, brought together by chance or fate, could build something that would endure long after they were gone. And so, on the Dakota prairie, where the wind still whispered through the grass and the stars still shone bright in the endless sky, the memory of Morgan and Marisol Hartwell remained, as eternal and beautiful as the love they had shared.